I've been talking about how I came to the insights that created the Life Process program for coaching for addiction. I've been talking about my personal background, how I grew up, and some of the research that really influenced my thinking. Now, in a way, I'm a fortunate person because I bridged between some of the very earliest experts in the addiction field, pioneers in the field, Norman Zinberg, Charles Winnick, Isidore Chine, Harold Mulford. And I personally lived through, I was in college and graduate school during the 60s. Something else happened in the 60s that really had a giant impact on me as well as the addiction field. That was the war in Vietnam. Now, I'm not going to talk about the war per se. I'm going to talk about the experience soldiers had during the war. In Vietnam, a lot of young men away from home for the first time in their lives went to Southeast Asia, where heroin was abundant and plentiful. And many of these young men took heroin, and in many cases, they became addicted to it. I should say, before describing that situation, opioids, heroin was a distillation from morphine, which is a distillation from opium, had been plentiful in the United States and England throughout the 19th century. It was common to use opioids. There was a tincturated substance called laudanum. Laudanum was a painkiller that people used, and they sometimes gave it to babies. It wasn't regarded as a special kind of substance. It wasn't regarded as something that people had to be especially wary about it. They used it in all kinds of formulations and in all kinds of situations. It was commonplace. It was only later in the 20th century that we developed this corrosive fear of opioids. Heroin was distilled purified out of morphine in 1898 by the Bayer Company. And it came to embody our fears about narcotics. And in 1914, heroin and cocaine had been basically legal in the United States. People could purchase it in drugstores. In 1914, the Harrison Act made it illegal, essentially, to use heroin or cocaine. Throughout the 20th century, then, heroin was something that people knew nothing about. As I described, when I was in college and graduate school, I knew people, and I would tell them things I read about heroin, and they would say, "Get out of here," and I would say, "Well, how would you know? You've never taken heroin." The Vietnam War changed that, where we got a large sample of people to take heroin. And a strange thing happened. Soldiers became addicted in Vietnam, and the reason we know they're addicted, a researcher named Lee Robbins, that's a woman, a professor of sociology at Washington University in St. Louis, studied these men. And she said to them, when you were in Vietnam, if you could not get your heroin supply, did you go through withdrawal? If they went through withdrawal, that was the classic definition of addiction. She then followed that group of men, the addicted soldiers in Vietnam, for 1 year follow-up and a 3-year follow-up. And everything she wrote kind of amazed her. She said, well, everything that we found about these people was different from what we had been led to expect. The first remarkable thing was that by and large, the men gave up heroin. They certainly ceased to be addicted when they came back to the United States. Many of them said they were able to get heroin if they wanted it, but they chose not to. Think about it. Why would a human being who was addicted to heroin in Vietnam, fly home from Southeast Asia, get back to his family, get back to school, go back to work, and cease taking heroin or cease being addicted to heroin. It's kind of commonsensical, isn't it? Something about the situation changed. And of course you would say, well, they were at war. That was one thing. The second thing was that they were just hanging around with a lot of other young men, and that's a high-risk taking group. But the third thing was they were kind of aimless. They weren't really progressing in their lives. Everybody was at odds with the Vietnam War. Even the guys who were fighting there were thinking, what are we doing here? That whole situation changed when they returned home. Now, I said they didn't take heroin when they got home. That's not 100% true. About half of them did take heroin. Nonetheless, the vast majority of those men did not, despite taking the same drug they had been addicted to, did not become re-addicted when they took heroin stateside. Ultimately, at the end of 3 years, only about 7% of the men who had been addicted in Vietnam became re-addicted in the United States. But Lee Robbins found something more about those men. In general, the men who became re-addicted were men who were involved in more antisocial worlds prior to going to Vietnam. In other words, to some extent, Vietnam imposed heroin on them, but they were really still leading the same kind of lifestyle that they had led back then. I read this about the Vietnam research before Archie Brodsky and I wrote Love and Addiction, and we made a big deal about it because it changes really the whole view we have of addiction. And I want to quote somebody, Richard Wilbur, who is Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health and Environment. This is his quote: "Vietnam disproved everything I ever learned in medical school. I thought once you became addicted to a narcotic, in particular heroin, you were addicted for life. In fact, people's behavior was much, much more fluid than that." Think about that. Think about that. If you were just using common sense, you would say, well, of course, people are going to change their behavior quite a bit after they leave a war zone in Asia and return home. But what's that tell us? What I've just described to you, 3 things were involved in the addiction. There was the drug heroin. There was the situation, Vietnam versus stateside. And there was the person. Some people, their addictions persisted. That's a 3-way model of addiction. It's not a model of addiction that's linked solely to the drug. That's such a crucial insight for both the life process programs I'll describe, but also for our entire approach to drugs. Once you get off focusing solely on the drug, you start thinking, well, how can we improve people's environments on the one hand, and for those people who tend towards antisocial lifestyles, how can we integrate them in society, make them more positive citizens, give them a chance to learn trades, to associate in positive communities? All of these things you'll see are very critical to my view of addiction and the life process program. I want to point out one problem that our view of addiction is stemming solely from the drug. People think, well, heroin, that's addictive, will give people other kinds of drugs and they won't be addicted to them. By the way, heroin replaced morphine, which people worried about because a lot of people became addicted during the Civil War. And of course, heroin itself became addictive. There's been a nonstop search for something called the non-addictive analgesic in the 20th century. well, here's a new drug. It takes people away from their pain, but it's not addictive. And that's how barbiturates were introduced. That's how the synthetic narcotics, the first synthetic narcotics, was Demerol. That's how benzodiazepines were introduced. It's a drug that takes away anxiety and pain. That's how Halcion and other kinds of sleeping sedatives were introduced. And that's how fentanyl was introduced, along with other synthetic modern narcotics. My point is, people in Vietnam used heroin as a way of escaping anxiety and uncertainty. When they came home, the same people, even those who took the same drug, didn't need it. It's not the drug in and of itself which is addictive. And we're constantly seeking to label this drug or that drug addictive. By the way, right now, everybody's heard of fentanyl, but there's a big push to recognize how addictive benzodiazepines, which are commonplace tranquilizers, are. And some people say, well, they're really more addictive than narcotics. So you see, I had a whole different view of addiction, but it didn't come from nowhere. It came from Vietnam. It came from the American history with drugs. It came from theorists and researchers like Winnick, Zinberg, Chain, and Mulford. It came from my own personal experiences with people, my own family life, for example. And I was developing all of these things together into my book called Love and Addiction. Love and Addiction, which I wrote in 1975 with Archie Brodsky, proposed what is now called the process model of addiction, which is that people can become addicted to any kind of an experience that they find overpowering or obligatory, or that somehow remedies their anxieties and fear and pain in life. And that experience doesn't have to come from a drug. And I'm going to talk more about that when I talk about our life process program.